The verdict is in for the trial of Derek Chauvin, and he was found guilty on all counts for the murder of George Floyd. When it first happened, the video provoked horror and condemnation from everybody. But like everything else in America, it quickly became deeply politically polarised. So, what just happened? What does it mean? Let's have a look. Yesterday, the George Floyd murder trial came to its conclusion with the jury delivering a verdict of guilty for all three charges: second and third degree murder and second degree manslaughter. Derek Chauvin, the police officer whose image kneeling on Floyd for 9 minutes sparked riots across America and wider, will be sentenced in a few weeks but faces decades in jail. This is a trial that was hugely high profile and had become deeply politicised, and it's put America into a pretty difficult place. First of all, let's separate two things out. One, the outcome of the trial itself. Due process has been followed. Chauvin was found guilty by a jury that had seen all of the evidence and heard all of the arguments. Now maybe, as some people are suggesting, the trial wasn't fair because of the high profile, because of some of the inflammatory political statements and all of that. And maybe that's true, but there's due process for that as well. Undoubtedly, the defence will appeal on precisely those grounds, and those arguments will be made in court. What most people do, of course, is to conclude that the trial was or wasn't fair based purely on whether it delivered the outcome that they preferred. Unless you watched the whole of the trial and all the evidence, and I know there's a few that did, not trusting the mainstream media to give a rounded account of it, unless you did that, then you're not really in a position to judge. I've followed this closely, I haven't been able to watch the full thing, and I am not going to express a view that this judgment was incorrect. 12 people took a relatively short time to come to the unanimous conclusion that Chauvin was guilty. Now maybe they did that because they were scared. But if they didn't, they would be identified, they'd become amongst the most hated people in the country. I mean, given the tone and tenor around this trial, that wouldn't be an unreasonable fear to have. Indeed, a use of force expert who testified for the defence had his former home vandalised, with a pig's head left there and its blood smeared all around. The perpetrators obviously weren't aware that he didn't still live there. Bad luck for the people who now do live there, of course. The jury were not sequestered through the trial, which does seem a bit strange to me, so they would have heard about all of those things and more. So yes, the fear on the part of the jury would have been reasonable. We have no evidence that it was the case that affected the judgment. It's all too easy to jump to conclusions about such things. So that's number one. Derek Chauvin got his day in court. Numerous legally trained commentators suggested that his defence had made a good case for reasonable doubt, at least on the murder charges. Having heard that defence, the jury nevertheless decided to convict. Done, pending the appeal. But the other side of this is the politicisation, and this is the biggest problem. How America and America's leaders treated this trial. Because the former will have long-term impact on one man, Derek Chauvin, but the latter is going to have a long-term impact on the nation as a whole. So overwhelmingly, this was presented as being America on trial over systemic racism. Joe Biden, celebrating the verdict, having formally stated it was what he was praying for, said systemic racism is a stain on the whole nation's soul. It was pretty remarkable for a sitting president to make the comments he did in advance of the verdict. Had it gone the other way, those comments would have fed the flames. The BBC repeated this narrative to its British audience, with its reporter Tara McKelvey stating it is a landmark case for police use of force against black people. But at no point during the trial was evidence presented or the argument even made that Chauvin acted with racist intent. You had a large man who was known as a serial offender, had been in and out of prison frequently, was clearly high on something and was resisting arrest and in an excited state. Those seem to be the relevant factors. None of them added up to the suggestion that he deserved to be harmed, let alone killed, but none of them hinged on the colour of his skin either. If Chauvin had a history of racist actions or words, you would expect that would have been brought out in the trial, but it wasn't. Had the arrest been successfully and safely completed, nobody would have been campaigning in the street arguing that the arrest itself was unjust, especially when it turned out that Floyd was in the car with his drug dealer. The Minneapolis Police Department expressed its frustration in its statement released immediately after the verdict was announced. There are no winners in this case, and we respect the jury's decision. We need the political pandering to stop and the race baiting of elected officials to stop. In addition, we need to stop the divisive comments, and we all need to do better to create a Minneapolis we all love. And this was after the force had made clear its disavowal of Chauvin's actions during the trial itself. Medaria Arredondo, the chief of the Minneapolis police, had testified that Chauvin had absolutely violated training, ethics and several departmental policies in his actions. That sort of testimony is extremely rare in these sorts of cases, and the prosecution itself, presumably knowing full well that juries often intuitively support the police in such cases, went out of its way to make clear in the closing arguments that the Chauvin case was about an individual officer, not about all police being on trial. Well, they may have said that to maximise their chance of a conviction. It wasn't enough to prevent the narrative from the media and political leaders being that it was about systemic police racism. The remarkable thing here was that there was a blanket assumption, almost certainly correct, that any verdict, except for the one that was delivered, would result in widespread rioting and looting. And the message on many fronts from the media and some politicians was that while they weren't encouraging such a thing, of course, it would be an understandable outpouring of rage at a racist system that had failed them. Because we'd heard this over the last year as riots took place. In Minneapolis alone, more than 1,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. The 3rd Precinct building, which was set on fire, is still boarded up. The intersection where George Floyd died is still closed to traffic. And there was very little condemnation of all of that at the time. The highlight of this was the statement by Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who said that protesters should become more confrontational if Chauvin were acquitted. Certainly no interest in due process there. This was a fact that the judge Peter Cahill complained strongly about, signalling to the defence that they'd gotten an opportunity. He said, "I'll give you that Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned." And if that was the outcome, would that be seen as the result of Maxine Waters making a huge mistake in prejudicing a trial? Or would it be seen as evidence that actually America is systemically racist after all? The answer to that question will depend on where you stand politically on current evidence, and that's kind of the point. Judge Cahill was absolutely correct when he said this: "I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that's disrespectful to the rule of law and the judicial branch and our function. I think if they want to give their opinions, they should do so in a respectful and in a manner that is consistent with their oath to the Constitution, to respect a co-equal branch of government. But there is no respect to the due process of law. The idea of innocent until proven guilty is now not supported. The idea of reasonable doubt is now not supported. So if you're able to get just outcomes from trials rather than miscarriages of justice, it'll happen only if the judicial system can stand against the strength of the pressure brought to bear by, in this case at least, the mob." Even lawyers were celebrating the rule of the mob. In this case, attorney Raul Reyes, CNN contributor, said this: "Nothing less than Derek Chauvin being found guilty on all 3 counts would have been acceptable. Legal arguments aside, no reasonable person could have watched the video of Floyd's death and not have held Chauvin fully accountable for such a depraved killing. Legal arguments aside." But the kicker came in his next statement. "But this time, our justice system worked. The American people who marched in the streets during a pandemic should be proud that their activism had an impact." So an attorney is arguing straight out that the legal system works when protests and riots influence the outcome. I mean, that's just astonishing. Oh, and he went on to add this: "The jurors should feel satisfied knowing they did the right thing while under tremendous pressure." It's disingenuous to say that without acknowledging that all the pressure being applied was to get them to come back with exactly the verdict that they actually did. They didn't come back with a verdict that was contrary to powerful pressure being applied. The point is, we don't know whether they came back with the right answer because they considered all of the evidence, or whether in fact they caved to the pressure from Maxine Waters and Raul Reyes and the mob. Both of those would look exactly the same as the outcome we just saw. Now, it doesn't matter to Reyes because they did the right thing. If this turns out to be a one-off aberration because of an extraordinary moment in history created by a particularly emotionally rending piece of widely seen video evidence, maybe it wouldn't matter. But the early political statements by Democrats particularly were very clear that they have no intention of this being a one-off. They immediately said that even though they got everything that they demanded, it wasn't enough. President Biden said exactly that in his statement following the verdict, and CNN jumped on that message and amplified it. The conviction of Derek Chauvin showed George Floyd's life really did matter to a justice system on trial. Now, millions of Americans wait to see whether a moment of rare hope will spur political leaders to deliver similar justice by reforming policing and eradicating systemic racism. And in case you didn't get the message, it went on to say this: it's possible nationwide reaction to Chauvin's conviction builds both elevated expectations for a president and a wave of momentum that could change the political atmosphere if handled skillfully. When the media goes into campaigning mode, it tries to bring about an outcome by reporting that there is pressure for that outcome. So, then the question arises, what does come next? If the George Floyd case was a tragic aberration rather than evidence of a systemic problem, how much damage do you potentially create if you lurch towards easy, radical solutions to a misdiagnosed problem? In the immediate aftermath of the killing, the initial demand from some of the most visible protesters was to defund the police. The slogan was interpreted differently by people, largely because they were struggling to rationalise something that was patently absurd on its face. CNN accused Republicans of being overly keen to claim that all Democrats agree with the radical fringe calling for defunding. And they're right about that. You shouldn't equate the voices of some as equaling the settled intent of the main body. That's a game that both sides play, pointing to the most extreme things said by the fringe of the other side and telling your own side this is representative of what they'll do if they get a chance. But it's not as though none of the Democrat-run cities didn't then go on to take action on exactly that principle. Councils in some cities like Los Angeles, New York, Portland, Oregon, Austin and Minneapolis tried it to varying degrees, and those initiatives have been followed by an increase in crime. In Minneapolis, murders are up nearly 50% since it cut its police budget. Its pledge to dismantle the police department has now been reversed, and it's hiring more officers. I'd be curious to know how many are queuing up for those jobs, to be honest. In Portland, murders have nearly tripled. In New York, shooting incidents are up 40% this year. Murders in Los Angeles are up by 28%. Do we know for a fact that those outcomes are cause and effect? I haven't seen evidence on that. It's suggestive, it's not conclusive. And you shouldn't, on the one hand, point to the fact that data doesn't support the contention that the police are systemically racist, which is what I've discussed here before, if then pointing to very similar correlation-based statistics to support your own arguments. But if administrations are now backtracking on those early policies, presumably they're seeing evidence that the early actions were a mistake. And they should also be aware that they don't have popular support, even if certain people are shouting very loudly. A recent poll has shown that the vast majority of Americans know that defunding the police is not the answer. Just 18% now support it, however you choose to define it. The number only goes up to 28% if you are specifically black Americans. So instead, the Democrats in Congress are focusing on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. It's hard not to notice in passing how the name George Floyd is being sanctified in all this process, by the way. Nancy Pelosi saying that his name would now be forever linked to the concept of justice. Well, look, he didn't deserve to be killed, and he's part of a community that feels victimised. You can get all that and still wonder about the character and life history of St. Floyd at a time when people are changing the names of their schools from Abraham Lincoln because he's not considered pure enough, idealising without any qualification whatsoever a frequently convicted criminal. It's an odd outcome. But anyway, the George Floyd Policing Act would introduce a ban on chokeholds, as well as no-knock warrants of the kind used before the death of Breonna Taylor last year. It would become easier for police officers to be sued in the civil courts. There would be a new national registry of police misconduct, mandated anti-discrimination training, bans on racial and religious profiling, body and car cameras required, deadly force would be used only as absolute last resort. Some of that might be sensible. A lot of it could be dismissed as looking like you're doing something while not actually doing that much. I'm sure most police officers would say that deadly force was already a means of absolute last resort. Remember, not even the prosecution alleged that Derek Chauvin intended to kill George Floyd, fully aware as he was doing so that he was being videoed by citizens. How this plays out is an open question. Biden has a long history of supporting police unions, might be very wary of alienating voters in the political centre. But at the same time, he knows that he owes his election as president in significant part to black voters, and he's under increasing pressure from the left wing of his own party. And this is the point. Once you've set the momentum rolling on this explosive narrative, it will take on a life of its own. Politicians should have been showing leadership, making themselves unpopular with some for sure, by arguing for respect for due process in the George Floyd case, arguing that justice was about hearing the evidence and coming to a judgment, not presupposing what the right answer should be. And they pointedly did the opposite. So you have now trained people to assume that every time a black person is killed by police, regardless of circumstances, it's systemic racism and rioting is the expected and justified response. On the day of the verdict being announced, we also got news that another black person, a teenage girl, was shot by police. Ma'Khia Bryant was the girl in question. Her mother said that she had a motherly nature about her and she promoted peace. After the shooting, a crowd gathered and were saying things like, "Enough is enough." Floyd family attorney Benjamin Crumb tweeted, "As we breathed a collective sigh of relief today, a community in Columbus felt the sting of another police shooting." Which is a case in point, because the police body cam footage was released that showed the peace-promoting Ma'Khia attacking a girl with a knife. The police officer yelled at her to get down. She ignored that, after which she then lunged at a second girl with a knife, at which point she was shot. Reports suggest that an inquiry is now underway, officials urging local residents to remain calm. The officer involved, who's not been named, has been placed on paid administrative leave. So literally, to save the life of another black youngster. That one probably doesn't turn into anything, but think about the pressure of this now. If that police officer had misread the situation in any way, they could have found themselves in the dock, with politicians and their own leaders calling for their head. Might that not tempt you to, not fire? And if that had been how it had played out and one or both of those other girls had been stabbed to death, would the consequences for the police officer have been as bad as trying to stop it and making a mistake? Where do the incentives line up for the police from now on? So look, where does this leave us? Maybe there's a strong case to be made that the remarkable, huge profile and the emotion and the politicking around this case made a fair trial impossible. The defence will no doubt make that case. They might be successful, although the odds are against it. That said, Chauvin took a course of action for 9 minutes that his colleagues raised concerns about, concerns which he dismissed, and actions have consequences. I still think that arguments relating to the appropriateness of the murder charges have some real force, but it's not beyond the bounds of reason that 12 jurors heard all the evidence and concluded that he was guilty of murder. Disagreeing with the outcome of a murder trial isn't normally a political statement. It shouldn't be here. The point is that politics has placed America on a downward spiral, like a couple in a toxic relationship where they start keeping score every time the other person does something wrong. America is now hypersensitized to incidents of police action against black people. Either police will continue to try to do their job, and those incidents will happen again, and those things will blow up every time until something gives way in the fabric of your society, or you're going to train them never to use dangerous force against black perpetrators of crime, regardless of the circumstances, which will have other consequences as the genuine scumbags in all of this become emboldened, knowing the advantage that they now have. The worst of all worlds is the most likely outcome, and you're going to get both of those at the same time. America is in a hole, and it needs to stop digging. And none of that is about the decision of a jury in a courtroom on the 20th of April 2021. It is about the political polarisation of America and a failure of leadership.